I'm Susan Farr, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Government here at Harvard, and I want to welcome you to this first of several events this afternoon that will honor Joseph Nye, who is retiring at the end of this academic year. He has a long association with the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and that WCFA is very, very proud to be the sponsor of this occasion, and may I acknowledge Michelle Lamont, its current director. Joe has had his intellectual home for some time now in the Kennedy School, where he was dean from 1995 to 2004, and he is also a university professor, meaning that he has a role in the university that goes far beyond any single department. But he joined the Harvard faculty in 1964, and so that means he has had a very, very long relationship with this side of Harvard Square, and we wanted to take the opportunity, knowing that the Kennedy School will be having its own events, to highlight those years that he spent with us as part of the Weatherhead Center community and as part of the government department and generally the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. These events would not have been possible without working very closely with Jorge Dominguez, with whom we organized this together, and it's really been a pleasure bringing this together. And much of the work was done by Shinju Fujihira on the staff side. He did a fantastic job. He's executive director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations, and I want to thank him. May I add that the program on U.S.-Japan relations, in recognition of the fact that Joe has been a member of our faculty advisory committee for a number of years and is a very important figure in Japan, we are proud to be co-sponsors of this particular symposium. Google the term soft power, and you get 34.7 million hits. Making it one of the most widely known terms in international relations and foreign policy to emerge over the past 3 decades. When you Google it, up pops a definition from Wikipedia, not WikiLeaks, though you never know for sure, crediting it unambiguously to Joseph Nye. Joe Nye has made many significant intellectual contributions, but we chose soft power as the topic of this symposium in recognition of its importance in public and academic debate, and may I say its even greater importance right now in this transition period, a period of great uncertainty over where the world and the United States are headed right now. So it gives me a great pleasure to open up this session today, and my final duty, may I mention afterwards, this session ends at 3:45. At 4:15, we have a lecture by a distinguished a visitor today to Harvard from Princeton, also long associated with us, Bob Cohan, and he will be looking in particular at populism in the 20th century. That's at 4:15. But now let us turn to this symposium. My final duty is to introduce Beth Simmons, who will be the moderator of the panel. She is the Andrea Mitchell Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, has that position since the fall of this year, but she is a very beloved member of this community here. At Harvard, she received her PhD in 1991 in the government department, where she worked with both Robert Cohan and Joseph Nye. She taught at Duke and University of California, Berkeley. She joined the Department of Government in 2002 and has been a wonderful colleague since that time. Therefore, she spent 14 years with us until Penn lured her away for magnificent new opportunities, and particularly to associate more closely with the law school at Penn. Here at Harvard, she was the Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs and was an outstanding director of the Weatherhead Center from 2006 to 2013. She has numerous publications, but may I just mention 2, both of them prize-winning books. The first, Who Adjusts? Domestic Sources of Foreign Economic Policy During the Interwar Years, 1923 to 1939. And a book called Mobilizing for Human Rights, International Law in Domestic Politics, both of these books won the Woodrow Wilson Award from the American Political Science Association for the best book published in the U.S. on government politics and international affairs. May I turn things over to Beth Simmons?
Thank you. Well, we're very fortunate today to have a panel of Joe's students, friends, and intellectual interlocutors. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the topic as well as to introduce our panelists today. I guess once you Google soft power, it's important to maybe put the definition out there, just in case anybody hasn't Googled it lately or just needs a little refresher in Foreign Policy 101. Soft power, according to Joe Nye's 2004 book, is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payments. It arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideals, and policies. When our policies are seen as legitimate in the eyes of others, our soft power is enhanced. And Professor Nye provided us with 3 examples in his 2004 book of iconic moments, symbolic instances in which U.S. soft power was on display. And let me just mention very quickly what a few of his examples of those iconic moments. The impact of FDR's For Freedom speech at the end of the Second World War, the impact in Europe at the end of that conflict. Chinese students with a replica of the Statue of Liberty in Tiananmen Square. Newly liberated Afghans in 2001 asking for a copy of the U.S. Bill of Rights. Now, Professor Nye realized that in the context of the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, that, quote, attraction can turn to repulsion if we act in an arrogant manner and destroy the real message of our deeper values. So when we thought of putting this panel together today, the subject of soft power in a tough world seems especially appropriate. And in my view, the world is a tough one right now on at least 2 fronts. Internationally, with a declining but feisty Russia, China on the rise, and violent radicalism brandishing a new kind of soft power around the world, it's a tough world internationally. But domestically, it seems to me that it is a tough world as well in many ways. Americans seem divided in some ways over what it is that we actually stand for. And in that sense, it's a tough world as well. I have 3 questions I guess I would just throw out there, and I wonder if at some point they may be discussed. I don't know. The panelists have not been told what to discuss. All of them have their own interesting points to make. But I would ask, first of all, can we simultaneously attract as we retract from alliances, from human rights, from a posture of global generosity? Secondly, can we attract internationally when domestic politics are so polarized and seemingly around some basic American values like tolerance, truth, and equality? And thirdly, if FDR's 4 freedoms, the Statue of Liberty, and the U.S. Bill of Rights were the iconic moments capturing soft power in the 1990s, what will the 3 analogous moments be in the next 4 to 8 years? Well, the great thing about sharing is I don't have to answer any of these questions. I can sit down, having posed them. And at this point, what I would like to do instead is to turn to our speakers, our 3 visitors today, and introduce each one of them. And I'll do that serially. And then when it is time for them to come to the podium, I'll simply recognize them. But I'll wait and I'll say a few words about Joe before he rejoins the comments that he's going to hear here. First of all, we have Bryan Hehir. He is the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at the Harvard Kennedy School. Also, he's the Secretary for Healthcare and Social Services in the Archdiocese of Boston. In terms of his research and his teaching, he teaches ethics in the use of force, intervention, and nuclear nonproliferation, the empirical and normative status of sovereignty, and the role of religion in world politics and in American society. His writings include The Moral Measurement of War, military intervention and national sovereignty, and Catholicism and democracy. And our second speaker will be Yuen from Khong. I think he gets the award for traveling the furthest, probably, coming all the way from Singapore. He is currently the Shing Professor of Political Science at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He was also a Harvard government student, a graduate student in the PhD program here, and we overlapped by a couple of years. He got his PhD in 1987, and then he became an assistant and associate professor of government in 1987 to 1994 here at Harvard. And then he moved to Oxford University, where he was the John G. Wynant University Lecturer in American Foreign Policy and a Fellow of Nuffield College. That was 1994 to 2015. No, yes, 2015, 2006, is that right?
About that, yeah. Yeah.
Six?
Yeah.
Six,
Yeah.
it is. And he's the Professor of International Relations now at in US from 2006 up to the present. In terms of his research, he works on US foreign policy, the international relations of Asia, and cognitive approaches to international relations. He's written very important books. One is called The Analogies at War, Korea, Munich, Dien Bien Phu, and the Vietnamese Decisions of 1965, which was the co-winner of the American Political Science Association's Political Psychology Section Book Award in 1994. He's currently working on some long-range projects as well, one on international politics, rules of the game, and another on the American tributary system. And then third, we have David Welch. And David he was also a graduate student here at Harvard. Again, Yuen, David, and I all overlapped here in the PhD program. We all worked in various ways with Joe. Currently, he's a senior fellow. David is at the and chair of global security at the Center for International Governance and Innovation. He's a professor of political science at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo. He got his PhD here at Harvard in 1990, and his research covers the area of international relations theory, foreign policy decision-making, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Asia-Pacific security. He also has a series of award-winning books. One is Justice and the Genesis of War, which was written in 1993, and it was the 1994 winner of the Edgar Furness Award for an outstanding contribution to national security studies. He wrote another important book, also a prize winner, called Painful Choices, A Theory of Foreign Policy Change, which was the winner of the International Studies Association, ISSS, Book Award for the best book published in 2005 or 2006. And with our honoree today, he was a co-author of Understanding Global Conflict and Cooperation, which was published in 1993 and is now in its 10th edition. So very long-lasting contribution indeed. So with that, what we'll do now is to turn to our three panelists, have you each offer comments between 10 to 12 minutes, and I'll give you some signals and let you know approximately where you are. And then we will hear from our honoree, Joseph Nye, and respondent to the comments. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's obviously an honor and a privilege to be part of this day honoring Joe Nye for his multiple intellectual contributions, but also you couldn't find a finer friend than Joe Nye. And you put those two things together, it's no small accomplishment. I just said to Joe, this day is a little bit like a canonization. All you need is the right colors around, and it would be similar to that. So let me begin. Professor Susan Farr provided us, as we have just been reminded of, two points of advice for our presentations. One, that they should be 10 minutes and focus on the idea of soft power and its implications and not try to cover Joe's monumental amount of work in international relations. To some degree, it's easier to meet the 10-minute limit than to separate the ideas from Joe's larger life. He has launched a conceptual scheme of hard, soft, and smart power, which has been widely taken up. Indeed, as he indicated in the book on the future of power, the idea has been used by so many people for so many reasons that there's a constant process of correcting what people do with it. It probably is not good to draw analogies of this scope, but in a sense, Joe's a little bit like George Kennan. After he announced containment, he spent the rest of his life trying to protect the idea from misuse, and Joe is in that status, I think. So the title, I wish to begin my comments with the title, Soft Power and a Tough World. I could imagine Joe might contest what the implication of that title might be, or it might be taken as an implication, namely that in a tough world, soft power is somehow irrelevant or marginalized. But Joe, of course, constantly argues that soft power is not meant to do everything. Hard power and soft power are complementary, not contradictory. Soft power exists in tandem with hard power. Soft power and hard power have evolved under Joe's guidance and writing into what he calls smart power. And so soft power doesn't have to deal with all the facts of a tough world, but it has the capacity to deal with many of them. Moreover, the tough world, as Beth has pointed out, this meaning also could be expanded or contracted. This audience could certainly fill out the phrase tough world in many specific ways, in great detail from different parts of the world. Today, on the one hand, from Syria to South Sudan provides an excruciating example of Hobbesian violence. On the other hand, a tough world is a world that's complicated. It could take on a different meaning here. The complexity is not so much violence as it is the dimensions of international relations today and how you sort out the different dimensions of a world that, as many have pointed out, simultaneously are undergoing both integration and fragmentation simultaneously. The fragmentation is within states, but the fragmentation since the end of the Cold War has also been the fragmentation of major powers not finding situations in the world as something that impels them to take action. So both dimensions, the Hobbesian violence and the complexity of the world, make up what it means to live in a tough world. So the question is how soft power relates to that. Now the next logical step, if I had more time than we do have, would be to take up at this point a phrase that Joe uses, namely that power is always related to context. And in assessing the capacities of different kinds of power, it is the context of the international system that must be assessed. That task is larger than either I can handle nor perhaps even the whole panel. And so faced with that task, I will leave it to others to talk about the context of international relations. I want to turn finally to what I would call the normative dimensions of Joe's treatment of soft power and power as a whole. Joe's work over the years has always had a normative dimension. There has always been a concern not only about the empirical complexity of the world, but the moral complexity of the world in terms of the fabric of policy and power. Hard power, for example, Joe addressed the question of the ethics of nuclear weapons, nuclear policy for years, and now in our own time he has moved to the ethics of cyber warfare. So the normative dimension has always been there. He draws a distinction between soft power and smart power. He tells us that soft power is not a normative term, it's a descriptive idea. Smart power, on the other hand, Joe describes as both descriptive and normative. I take what he means by that is that to get qualified as smart power, you have to pass tests not only of meeting empirical complexity, but you have to pass tests of addressing normative complexity. I understand the distinction that he makes between these two ideas. one carrying normative content, the other not. But beyond this, I suspect that there's more that Joe will be able to tell us about the distinctions between hard, soft, and smart in terms of their ethical complexity. At times in the future of power, particularly, he addresses in passing the ethics of dealing with hard power, referring to the just war doctrine at various points and talking about legitimation and limitation of power. Soft power, at the same time, can also be judged by normative criteria. In itself, it is not normative, but soft power must pass normative tests as well as empirical tests. And so as you take apart the relationship of hard and soft under the fabric or under the framework of smart power, I think the ethical complexity gets deeper than it would be if you treated only hard power alone or only soft power alone. Certainly questions like the pursuit of human rights, which would fit in the soft category, can certainly raise significant ethical questions. Questions about how pursuit of human rights, or in the interest of human rights for the United States, can run up against security questions. Whether one criticizes an ally that violates human rights or doesn't criticize them because security issues trump that. So if you think of hard, soft, and smart together in a kind of triangular relationship, the beginnings of the discussion of normative issues that Joe's raises, I think also can be pressed further. Finally, a different kind of normative issue, and that is the role of religion in its relationship to smart power. Joe mentions religion in passing more than once, in particularly, as I say, in the future of power. He mentions it as part of culture and values, and then he mentions it in terms of naming the threats that confront us in a tough world today, calling attention to particularly excuse me, he mentions it in calling in particular in attention to radical Islam. I raise it to ask where, if any place, religion fits in the hard, soft, and smart power. I raise it partly because we have Bob Cohen with us today, respected on all fronts in his treatment of international relations. He said after the September 11th attack, the 9/11 attack, Bob said that all major theories of world politics are relentlessly secular with respect to motivation. They ignore the impact of religion despite the fact that world-shaking political movements have so often been fueled by religious fervor. Since that time, there's been a kind of cottage industry grow up about the role of religion in world politics. I'm not here pressing for a larger role. It is an analytical question. It isn't the question of whether religion should be granted respect. It is the analytical question of what one misses in this tough world if there's not an ability to relate politics, economics, law, and religion in a systematic way. What does one not know if there's no attention to the religious factor? That question did not receive a lot of attention from Joe. Others received so much attention that it was the book and the phrase has been wildly successful. But I wonder about religion. Joe mentioned that economics can either be hard or soft. Religion can be hard or soft, unfortunately. And the question of where it might fit in the scheme that Joe has given us is one question I'd like to leave with him. Thank you.
Like Bryan, I feel deeply honored to be here. And when I received the invitation to join the panel, I knew that I had to come to pay tribute to the work of a mentor, a former boss at the Center for International Affairs when I was the director of student programs and Joe was the director of the CFIA then. and to pay tribute to the work of a friend and one of the most distinguished political scientists of any generation, and also a scholar practitioner who has made a difference to the way we think about the world and the security we feel within it. Okay. I want to begin by saying what soft power has meant to me. The beauty of Joe's soft power idea, for me, is that it provides a vocabulary in 2 words that captures something that we, especially non-Americans, have encountered all along. So my days of doing schoolwork in Penang, Malaysia, where I'm originally from, or loitering in the cold premises of the United States Information Service downtown, perusing college catalogs and borrowing books on Jefferson and mine, they could really write. Or trying out Bob Dylan's albums in the local record store, were all instances of my engagement with soft power, American soft power primarily. To be able to view all these activities only in retrospect, because when I was doing it in the 70s, the term wasn't around, right? To be able to view all these activities in retrospect as soft power endows me with a certain self-understanding and a sense of wonderment that I would not have had without the vocabulary. But it is legitimate to ask, so what? What might have those encounters with soft power had on my life? I think biography would have to be the way to go if we wanted to answer this question. But for today, I want to tackle the so what question differently. I want to approach it by using Joe's notions of hard, soft, and smart power, perhaps in an analogous way to Bryan, to illuminate the evolving geopolitical dynamic in the tough neighborhood that I come from, namely East Asia. Let me begin with the following claim. We are seeing the beginnings of a power transition process in Asia. Asia's rising powers, I will focus on China in my remarks, are catching up with the established power, the United States. And China in particular is beginning to challenge US predominance by fashioning asymmetrical military strategies, creating rival regional institutions, providing alternative narratives of the good life, and wielding its economic clout in hard, soft, and smart ways to get the outcomes that it prefers. How does soft power figure in this process? Some might say that it is irrelevant because it's basically about hard economic and military power. But if you look more carefully, I would argue that soft and smart power are deeply implicated. And that is where the introduction of these concepts, I think, have allowed us to see things that we normally would have missed, especially when it comes to considerations that will be shaping the evolving strategic allegiances or alignments in the region. The mantra in most East Asian countries today is that they do not want to have to choose between the US and China, preferring to be friends with both. But as the strategic rivalry between the US and China increases, this will become increasingly difficult to do. Living in Singapore as I do in the last 1.5 years, you can feel the pressure these days, and I wager that in the years ahead, the countries in the region will have to choose between the two. It is true that on most measures of soft power, China lags behind the US, the EU, and Japan. Maoism and Confucian institutes do not come across as inviting as Apple, Harvard, Bob Dylan, democratic values, anime, manga. But I do want to suggest that in recent years, China has found or stumbled upon an attractive narrative that is having an impact on the thinking of some in East Asia, and especially Southeast Asia. It is a narrative, an invitation that leverages on China's post-1978 achievements in economic development, with future plans based on an ancient script, namely one belt, one road, OBOR, O-B-O-R. The story goes something like this. In the last decade or so, China has replaced the US as the #1 trading partner of most countries in East Asia. And despite its current economic problems, it is the wave of the future. Meanwhile, it is creating rival alternative institutions. Think the AIIB, RCEP, the New Development Bank from the BRICS, and the FTAAP. All right? Think about these alternative institutions that seem relevant to the economic needs of the region, and most standardizingly, the One Belt, One Road idea, OBOR, that seeks to revive the ancient Silk trade routes and that links China to Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. So OBOR comes with a rather compelling strategic political dimension. If it becomes a reality, and that's a very big if, granted, China will be well poised to attract countries that form part of the route into its political economic orbit. It will position China as the economic hub of a trade network that runs from Xi'an to Rotterdam and from Fuzhou to Malacca to Djibouti to Venice. And it will augment China's ability to shape the rules of the international economic political game substantially. It is an idea that incorporates attraction, agenda setting, inducement, and institutions. And it also has to be said that in terms of political values, China's approach is not to question the internal sovereignty of its interlocutors, or put another way, it is indifferent to what the Dutertes of the Philippines do within their countries. This may prove quite attractive to many of the 60-odd countries across the 3 continents that may form part of OBOR. This package may look actually suboptimal, especially on the values part, from the US perspective. And as attractive as OBOR may sound, the obstacles to its becoming a reality are formidable. But that has not prevented everybody in Southeast Asia from jumping on to the OBOR bandwagon. From Cambodia to Thailand to Malaysia to Indonesia, they all want to be part of the action, to participate in the maritime Silk Route, even with their unresolved disputes with China in the surrounding seas of Asia. This huge economic carrot mixes hard and soft power. One may even call it smart power, because it comes with a rider, and that is those who seek to grow with China, to be part of this connectivity, will perforce be sensitive to China's interests in the region. As Hugh White, a prominent Australian strategic thinker, pointed out, even Australia, given that China is its top trading partner, has had to be sensitive or more accommodating to China's interests. What of the other Southeast Asian countries less rich than Australia? Will they, as a consequence of realizing where their future lunch is going to come from, gravitate away from the US toward China? If we look at the alignments along a left-right continuum today, with the left signifying alignment, strong alignment with China, and the right-hand side, strong alignment with the US, I will put Cambodia and Laos on the left, i.e. they've basically chosen to align with China, while Vietnam, Singapore, South Korea, and Japan are on the right-hand side of the continuum, closer to the US, with Japan the closest. In between these two ends are Myanmar, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, the ones who are so-called hedging, according to IR scholars of the region. Even those that I have described as being closer to the US, such as Vietnam and Singapore, are seen to be hedging by some analysts. The 2 Southeast Asian treaty allies of the US, Thailand and the Philippines, have edged toward China in recent times because of, one, economic opportunity. Duterte of the Philippines came back from his visit from the Philippines with 14 billion worth of trade deals. All right. And secondly, they're finding China's no comment on democratic processes or human rights approach more attractive than the Obama administration's lectures on those issues. So the Obama administration actually has found non-formal strategic partners like Singapore and Vietnam to be more reliable. Singapore, for example, has been so vocal on the importance of observing international law, maintaining freedom of navigation, and the importance of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, as a means for the US to reassert its economic centrality in Asia, that it has not endeared itself to China very much. Why does all this matter? It matters because America's position as the preeminent power or the benign hegemon in East Asia is being challenged, and the strategic alignments of the countries in the region in the years ahead will be a determinant of the eventual outcome of the tussle. That the rising power of China's heft will want to, in the first instance, seek co-equality with the dominant power, the US, and eventually displace it in a few decades hence, is a natural phenomenon in the IR lexicon. To be sure, Jonai had won all the debates with the decanists since the early 1990s. But this time, things are less clear-cut, not least because of domestic politics in America. My ruminations about the fluid and shifting strategic alignments of the East Asian states would have been relevant whoever won the presidential election. Trump as president, however, throws up greater imponderables. TTP will be aborted, and with that, the possibility of US economic leadership in Asia. The pivot to Asia may be under threat, although I suspect that in the end, he's unlikely to withdraw US troops from Japan and South Korea. The rest of Asia will take their cues from his approach to the region and will have incentive to realign themselves if it becomes clear that the US is no longer interested in being the underwriter of the security and economic order in the region. I'll end then by making a not very bold claim. The new administration desperately needs some lessons on how to combine hard and soft into smart power if it wants to keep America preeminent in East Asia.
This is my nag timer. I'm going to save Beth the hassle of reining me in. It counts down in big numbers and tells me exactly how much time I have left. Let me just add my voice to the chorus. It's a real treat to be here. I first met and began working with Joe 33 years ago, and I think that's maybe the most recent of the panelists. And I had the benefit of many gifted teachers when I was a student here at Harvard. One of my many very gifted teachers was Judith Sklar, of whom it was once said that she treats all of her students as colleagues and some of her colleagues as students. And Joe, I think it's fair to say, treats everyone as a colleague, and I feel very lucky that I still get to be Joe's colleague as co-author on his textbook. And let me stress that it's actually his textbook. I'm doing what I can to keep it up to date, but it's really Joe's intellectual property, and it's my real privilege and pleasure to keep that flame alive. So Joe, it's been great, and I look forward to the next 20, 30 years working together with you on the textbook. It's undeniably true that our field, international politics, has obsessed historically with hard power. That's probably the topic that gave rise to the discipline in the first place. But of course, we all know that hard power isn't the only kind of power. If you think of power very generically as the capacity to get the outcomes that you want, various different ways you can do that. Hard power is one, wielding carrots and sticks. There are institutional ways of doing it. There's convening power, there's agenda-setting power, and Joe brought to the table this concept of soft power, which I think it's fair to say some of us might have had an intuitive feel that there was something there, but Joe was the first person to give it clear articulation and to start using it in a serious way in foreign policy analysis. I want to sort of concentrate on the topic of wither soft power, but I want to start by saying that I think there's at least three different ways in which soft power can work. One of them I would call the admiration-emulation pathway. In other words, you simply do things well and hope that others admire it and emulate it, and will accordingly do the things you'd like them to do. And of course, this was the basis, I think, of early American foreign policy and the city on the hill approach. America would stand as a moral beacon to the world, and with luck, the world would follow suit and respect the United States and indirectly engage American interests, support American interests. I think there were both supply side and demand side problems even back then with the city on the hill approach, but that's certainly one way in which you could exercise soft power. Second way is what I would call the persuasion pathway. And in this model, you essentially use information and advice and good offices and so on to try to persuade others to do things differently and in accordance with the ways that would realize your preferred outcomes. And for that, of course, you need information, you need expertise, you need skilled diplomats and so forth. It's an engagement pathway, whereas the first one is fundamentally not an engagement pathway. The third one I would call the solidarity pathway. And this is where, in effect, you cultivate shared identities with other countries and jointly you seek to realize goals that you all consider to be shared interests, largely because of your shared identity. Now, that first pathway, the admiration-emulation pathway, doesn't require any particular kind of relationship. You just have to be who you are and do what you do and hope that others will watch and appreciate and follow suit. But the two other pathways do require something in particular to work well, and that is trust. And trust is a concept that, again, has been underappreciated, I think, in our discipline. And to the extent that it's been analyzed at all, it tends to be analyzed in a kind of econometric way, or economistic way, as a sort of generalized reciprocity. I think trust is actually better thought of as a kind of confidence you can have in others based on their disposition and on your relationship with them. And it's very different from a situational confidence of the kind where you might not necessarily trust another, but because they're not in a position to harm you, you can give them space. And that, of course, is the first step you take in an adversarial relationship to try to transform it into a trusting one. You start with the confidence and security building measures, the transparency measures, and so on. But at the end of the day, the goal in building trust is to build a shared identity and a strong sense that others can be entrusted with your well-being as well as their own. You can't just manufacture trust. Trust requires another thing that's very important, and that is empathy. And by empathy, I just mean the capacity to see the world from another's perspective. And empathy is crucial for trust because you cannot know that somebody is well disposed toward you unless you can appreciate how they see you. So empathy is a very important ingredient, essential ingredient, I would argue, for building trust. So soft power, in its, at least two of its manifestations, requires cultivation of empathy and works best in a context of trust. Now, soft power, as the others have said already, is not something distinct from other kinds of power. In fact, if you enjoy soft power, you will most likely enjoy enhanced convening power, enhanced agenda-setting power, and even enhanced hard power, because you'll have friends and allies who will do such things as provide basing opportunities for you overseas, force multipliers, and so forth. So soft power can be seen in a way as the basis of all kinds of power, and the more you have of it, the better you are, better off you are. So let's turn to Donald Trump. Sorry about that. What will American foreign policy soft power be like under a Trump administration? I think this is deeply problematic. So the first pathway, the admiration-emulation pathway, really requires that others can see that you stand for something and that you have a clear and coherent understanding of the world and approach to it. And so unpredictability, instability, foreign policy by tweet are not really conducive to cultivating admiration or emulation. What about persuasion? The art of the deal. Will the next phase of U.S. foreign policy be the art of the deal? Again here, trust is a big issue. And I think the incoming president has cultivated a sense of distrust, and it's really quite a serious one, possibly an unprecedented one in the history of American foreign policy. And even with on the basis of good information and good insight and good advice, it may be that the incoming president's dispositional characteristics will incline others not to follow the persuasion pathway. Solidarity pathway. Again, all of a sudden we're in a strange world where the United States seems to be breaking ranks, right, left, and center with the countries that it has made common cause with. Now, it remains to be seen whether this will be true after January, and some of the betting money is that it won't, and I hope that the betting money is correct. But when all of a sudden the United States is being led by an administration that seems to stand for radically different things than what had undergirded the solidarity of the Western liberal international security communities, I think that's a problematic state of affairs. What about smart power? I mean, if you don't have much soft power, it's hard to do smart power, but even if you had the soft power, you have to have the smart. And I really do think there's grounds for concern over the course of the next few years that the knowledge, the insight, the capacity to match means to end is there to wield smart power effectively. So what will the next 4 years look like from a soft power perspective? I think it may be lean times, and I'd rather end on an optimistic note because I'm an optimist by nature. But these days I'm actually having a very hard time being an optimist. Who will take up the soft power leadership role globally? It's hard to say. I don't think it's China. I think China's hard power resources are undeniable and growing. China is certainly trying to exercise convening power and a jettisoning power, but I just don't see the attraction. I don't see the persuasion. I don't see the solidarity. I think they're all fundamentally lacking on the Chinese side. Europe is in an acute existential crisis. The task for Europe over the next few years will be keeping Europe united and afloat. Britain is essentially largely checked out for the short term. France, again, caught up in a domestic turmoil similar to the one that saw Donald Trump elected. Angela Merkel is still trying to fly the flag, but again, limited success. Japan, I think, is doing well in the grand scheme of things, not necessarily in its immediate neighborhood from a soft power perspective, but globally, rather remarkably better than one might have expected several decades ago. Middle powers. As a Canadian, I have to talk about middle powers. Canadians, other middle powers, used to trade in soft power, usually through the persuasion pathway. But again, it'll only work to the extent that you've got your own ducks in order. And in Canada, unfortunately, we haven't for a few years. We're trying to get them back in order, but it remains to be seen how well we'll do that. But the Scandinavian countries, South Korea, there's a willingness there to try to play a soft power role. But I'm not sure what the demand side is. If the world is, in fact, turning inward, turning towards extremism, and rediscovering realpolitik, it will, I think, be a hard time for soft power down the road. So again, I wish I could end on a more optimistic note. But Joe, I think, will straighten us all out and find a way to turn that into something positive. Thanks very much.
So now I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to introduce Joe formally. You all know that he directed the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs from '89 to '93. Then he was 9 years as Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. Just as an indicator of soft power, a couple little factoids would be fun to throw in here as well. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, he was ranked as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy. In 2011, Foreign Policy named him one of the top 100 leading global thinkers. 2 examples of soft power right there. Recent books include, you've heard mention of these throughout the talks that we've had here today, but just to mention a few of his most recent, and I do say most recent because this is in less than a decade, The Power to Lead in 2008, The Future of Power, 2011, Presidential Leadership and the Creation of the American Era, 2013, Is the American Century Over, 2015, and again, that book that is now in its 10th edition, and it sounds like from what David was telling us, he's looking forward to maybe 10 more editions of The Understanding of Global Conflict and Cooperation. I also wanted to mention some of his public service and awards that he's, and the positions he's held in terms of public public service as well. In 1993 to 1994, he was chair of the National Intelligence Council. He received the Intelligence Community Distinguished Service Medal Award. In 1994 to 1995, he was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and he received the Department of Defense Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. And in 2014, he was appointed by Secretary of State John Kerry as chair of the Foreign Affairs Policy Board. So indeed, a scholar statesman, and I would like to welcome Joe to the podium to respond to some of the comments.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for being here. It's Bryan said it's like an installation. I thought maybe more like a funeral in which you get to go to your own funeral. Be always nice to know when you're not going to make it to your funeral, I assume, but it'd be nice to know what people are saying, and this is a chance to check that out. Except that people say nice things at funerals and installations and celebrations of a career. So I'm not sure. I have to pick up David's point about trust. But I thought all three observations were and four, because I want to come to Beth's introduction, were very helpful. I developed the idea of soft power because I felt that in our profession of international relations, we didn't pay enough attention to it. There was a great tendency that power was something you could drop on a city or drop on your foot, but that there were other ways to move people and affect them. I don't think the profession was spending enough time on it. So when I was writing the book about Bound to Lead, taking issue with Paul Kennedy about decline and disagreeing with him, and I totaled up all the hard power resources, the military resources and the economic resources. I say, there's still something missing. It doesn't really capture everything that allows us to move other people or to get the things we want. And that's when I started thinking about and developing the idea of soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And I think it has helped to expand the horizons in our profession somewhat, and also helped statesmen and policymakers to think a bit more broadly than they otherwise would. I think I was probably most amused or impressed in 2007 with two very, very different examples of people who picked up the idea of soft power, which wasn't my realist colleagues in the American Political Science Association, but one was Hu Jintao, the president of China at the time, who gave a speech to the 17th Party Congress saying that China needed to invest much more in its soft power, which quite impressed me because it's a smart power strategy. If your economic and military power is increasing, you're going to scare your neighbors into coalitions. But if you can increase your soft power at the same time, those coalitions will be less effective. So it seemed to me that Hu Jintao got the idea. And indeed, the Chinese spent billions of dollars to develop that. And I'll come back to that when I talk about Yuen's comments. The other example from 2007 was Bob Gates, who was a very hard-nosed civil servant, but a good one. I mean, somebody who was very thoughtful with a reality principle, who was then Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration. And he went to Kansas City in 2007, and he gave a speech, and he said, the United States, this is in the Bush administration, the time of the surge. So the United States has a problem, which is we don't invest enough in soft power. He said, it might seem strange that the Secretary of Defense comes to Kansas to plead for more money for the State Department. It might seem like man bites dog. But he said that's one of the real problems we have in the United States. And those two examples from 2007 led me to believe that some people did get the idea, even though, as Bryan said, very often it's misused for a variety of purposes. One misuse, and this comes to Bryan's comments, is sometimes people say soft power is good per se, and Bryan properly reads it that that's not my intention. It's a positivist concept. Bad people can have soft power. Bin Laden did not point a gun at the people who flew the plane into the World Trade Center. He didn't pay them. He attracted them through a pernicious version of a religion. And it's not clear why it's better to twist minds than to twist arms. I think if I make a case for a normative preference for soft power, it would be something along the following lines, that there are more degrees of freedom or autonomy that are involved. For example, if I want to steal your wallet or steal your money, and I take out a gun and I say, give me your money or else, and you don't, I shoot you. If you do, then I have your money. I get it right away. It's very clear what's happened. You don't have a lot of choice. You know, I say your money or your life. Well, it's not really a good bargaining position. But if, on the other hand, I say I'm a guru, and if you follow me, I will lead to nirvana on earth. And if you put your money into my bank account, I will work in this direction. And after I convince you of this, after a number of meetings, you transfer your money to my bank account and I abscond with it, the result is the same. I've stolen your money. But you had more degrees of freedom and choice in the second. Both of these are bad acts, one using hard power, the other using soft power. I have a slight normative preference for the second because it allows more degrees of freedom and autonomy for the other participant in the power relationship than you do with pure hard power. So, but that's a very minimalist claim, and I think Bryan was right in identifying me as not treating soft power as good per se, and very often people will treat it as though it's good per se, and no. Now, I think the point where Bryan catches me, and where he's absolutely right, is I really didn't pay enough attention to religion in the 2004 book or the 1990 book. And religion is an enormous source of soft power. And I think it's a resource by which you can develop either malign or benign soft power, depending on the perception of the recipient or the target. And I think the fact that I didn't do more about that is a deficiency in my work. I mean, and I appreciate that. I corrected a little bit more in the 2011 book on the future power. But I think what Bob Cohen said is right, that there's a strongly secularist orientation. I was sort of struggling against people like Ken Waltz, who said it's all structural, and religion was another dimension, and I didn't pay enough attention to it. On Yuen's comments, he's absolutely right that narrative is tremendously important. I think it was, I can't remember who it was that said that if you can determine whose story wins, it may be more important than whose army wins. In other words, that if you can control the narrative, you can have the outcomes you want by getting in people's minds and controlling their beliefs about the future. And it is interesting that in extreme cases, being able to create a sense of a wave of the future can attract. Think of, again, an extreme case, Stockholm Syndrome and Patty Hearst. It was that view that this was the future, this was the direction things were going, there were no alternatives. Or think of the way Hitler and Stalin used to try to make it clear that this was the direction things were going. In that sense, controlling the narrative into a wave of belief in inevitability, though we might think of it as perverse, nonetheless, it can attract people, which goes to this heart of soft power. And in that sense, I think what Yuen was saying about China creating a sense of inevitability, of building upon the fact that the major trading partner for all countries in Asia, not just Southeast Asia, I think now, and that they have this slogan, OBOR, One Belt, One Road, to revive a Silk Road, maritime and land Silk Road. The feeling that this is the wave of the future does lead countries then to hedge in one direction rather than another. Most countries right now in Southeast Asia want to have their cake and eat it too, which is natural. You want to have China for good economic relations, and you want to have America for good security relations. And the interesting question is, if you believe that the Americans are pulling back, and you believe the Chinese are going to get stronger and stronger, will you hedge, as Yuen said, and he had his country scaled by the amount of hedging they do? It's an interesting question of will that occur and how long will it take? Right now, China has a problem with soft power because it has territorial conflicts with almost all its neighbors. And when you have a territorial conflict, it makes it very difficult to escape the effects of nationalism. So if you are telling the Vietnamese that they should have a Confucius Institute to treat the glories of Chinese culture in Hanoi, and at the same time killing Vietnamese on the Paracel Islands, or putting a drilling rig in the Paracel Islands in an area that Vietnam claims as its territorial area within its outer continental shelf, or exclusive economic zone, the soft power you gained from the Confucius Institute vanishes because the Vietnamese nationalism overwhelms it. And there were indeed anti-Chinese riots in Vietnam a year ago, which a bunch of Chinese were killed. And that sets a limit to Chinese soft power, which I once said to the Chinese foreign minister, I said, you've got a real problem, which is you need to claim all these little islands, rocks, atolls, and so forth, because of nationalism at home. You can't give them up. But as you do that, you undercut your ability to project soft power in the region. And you've got to decide which of those is more important. And I don't think the Chinese really sorted that out yet. Yuen may be right that if they can develop a narrative of the wave of the future, that people will say, oh, the Americans are going to go someday anyway, so it may take 20 years, but I'll slide down this scale of hedgers that Yuen mentioned. But they're a long way from that right now. And I think it's interesting, if you look at Portland, which is a consultancy in London, has now for 2 years brought out an index. They call it the Soft Power 30. And it ranks countries in terms of soft power. It's interesting that the U.S. ranks number 1, China ranks number 28. I don't think China's going to bridge that gap anytime soon. But as Yuen said, if you can control the narrative, and as if we're seen withdrawing, that could make a big difference. Finally, let me turn to David's comment. Not finally, because I want to come to Beth's comments finally. But David's comments, I think he's absolutely right about these different mechanisms, about the ways that soft power works. The city on the hill, the admonish and emulate, is, I think, extremely important. But persuasion is as well. And the third, of developing shared identities and solidarity, is also very important. And that then does raise some interesting questions of what will happen to American soft power in the presence of a new administration. And I tend to agree with what he said, that the nastiness of the campaign, even if Trump hadn't won, I mean, imagine that Clinton had won, the nastiness of the campaign, I think, was such as to diminish American soft power. And if you have a presidency which continues in that tone, I think it will continue to undercut that. It's less of the shining city on the hill. Whatever you think of Ronald Reagan historically, and I think I underestimated him at the time, he had a wonderful optimism which tended to set a narrative about the future which others could accept. And I don't think I've seen that yet in Trump. I hope that he will find a way to develop it. On the second mechanism that David discussed, persuasion, I do think there that the distrust that's created by having a slogan, America First, when it's America First, where's everybody else? And if you push that America First slogan too hard, it undercuts soft power. It's not quite like the dilemma that China has of actually taking your neighbor's territory, but it has the same kind of effect. Your interests aren't so important. It's a zero-sum world, and my interests are all that matter. So I think that will undercut American soft power. And third, on the solidarity point, if you treat every alliance and networked relationship as a real estate deal, rather than something where you can generate trust over time, it begins to deteriorate. Some years ago, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, Bob Cohane wrote an article about diffuse reciprocity. And diffuse reciprocity doesn't mean you get paid off on each transaction. It means you build up an account over time. And I don't think you build up accounts by treating each deal as a real estate deal. The more hard-nosed you are, you may win on that deal. You may pay for it in the deal after and the deal after that. So I would project, I would tend to agree with David, I would project a reduction in American soft power over the Trump years if the Trump years continue in the same style that we've seen in the Trump campaign. And then finally, if I can come to Beth's questions, can you attract as you retract? A very nice phrase. I'd like to borrow that in the future, if you don't mind. Well, sometimes when the United States withdrew from Iraq, it actually increased its soft power. So there was a retraction. In the early Obama years, there was an increase in American soft power measured by various Pew polls and so forth, which had been undercut by Bush in the invasion of Iraq. So yes, you can attract while retracting, but a lot will depend on how, if it's seen as a retraction in a particular case, or whether it's a long-term retraction. And then if it's a long-term retraction, you're where Yuen said, which is that they own the narrative about the future. Beth's second point about polarization and can you attract when you're deeply polarized at home, I think the answer to that is we've already lost some soft power. And if I were to make a bet on what this Portland Soft Power 30 Index will say a year from now, when the next edition comes out, I doubt U.S. will be ranked #1 anymore. But I may be wrong. But that would be my answer to Beth's second question. And then the issue is, what about new icons? What is it that may give us something like that FDR for freedoms or a Statue of Liberty and so forth? And I will give you a historical case and then my candidate for the current icon. The historical case is in 1960s and 70s. The United States was wildly unpopular around the world because of our government policies in Vietnam. People were marching in the streets all over the world against the United States. But they weren't singing the Internationale. They were singing Martin Luther King's We Shall Overcome. Now, that's what you might call meta soft power. Here it is a bitter dispute about American government policy, but turning to an American cultural icon as the way of expressing it. And I wonder if after the Trump years, or in the beginning of the Trump years, whether my candidate for the equivalent of We Shall Overcome, or the new icon, might be the play Hamilton, which I had the good fortune to go see. The idea of seeing an African-American cast portraying the Founding Fathers and learning about Thomas Jefferson with all his racism from an African-American actor and having it all in rap music written by an American of Puerto Rican origin. That's quite extraordinary. So the same culture that produces a lot of the nastiness that we saw in the 2016 campaign also produced this extraordinarily creative way of looking back at history. I don't know if any of you listened to the soundtrack or seen the play, but at the end of it, one of the key lines is, "Who will tell my story?" To go back to narrative. And the idea that the story will be told by a younger generation with more immigrants, more women, fewer white men of my age, I think that may be the icon for our time. Anyway, those are my thoughts on four very helpful comments.
Thank you so much, Joe. And now we're going to open it up to questions. And we have till 3:45. If you could just wave your hand, I'll try to keep something like a queue. I don't think there is a mic. There is a mic because we're recording this session, if you don't mind. So are there any questions to begin with? Give you right in the back, Kathleen, right in the very back.
I'll grab my cup of water.
Yes.
Well, it's all well and good to talk about trust, but the incoming administration is inheriting a pretty large trust deficit as it is, isn't it? I mean, when the United States in NATO invaded and destroyed Libya, it was under the pretense of humanitarian intervention, which quickly turned into regime change, which created tremendous distrust with Russia and China. The same as has already been alluded to in Iraq, which was also undertaken under false pretenses. And both of the previous administrations have been spying at the highest levels on our nominal allies. As Hillary Clinton once said, we say one thing in public and we say another thing in private. So we've got a tremendous trust deficit already to overcome, both domestically and as well as internationally, don't we? It's a little unfair just to single out the Trump administration for you creating this all of a sudden out of a vacuum.
Well, you're right, because there is no Trump administration yet. So I was really referring to the style of the Trump campaign, not to the Trump administration. But you're correct that there are lots of things we've done which have destroyed trust in the past. I think the invasion of Iraq, you can see there by looking at public opinion polls that the attractiveness of the United States went down by about 20 to 30 points in every West European country, except some of the former Eastern Bloc countries, after the invasion of Iraq. So, I mean, you can measure the destruction of attractiveness or trust in that case. The Libya case is a little bit different in the sense that you're right that the initial resolution under responsibility to protect under the UN was not supposed to become regime change. It did become regime change, which meant the Russians and the Chinese felt that they were not going to give that kind of license again, thus their unwillingness to cooperate on a UN resolution on Syria, which they say we did that for you once, we're not going to do that again. On the other hand, many people felt that, unlike the invasion of Iraq, that the removal of Gaddafi or the destruction of Gaddafi's regime was a step that was consistent with the responsibility to protect, because he would have killed and continued to violate the human rights of his subjects. I would have faulted it less on that basis than the failure to follow up. We should have organized major UN peacekeeping forces or something which could include the Russians and Chinese, but something which would have tried to stabilize the country by then stepping back. You just, after destroying Gaddafi and then stepping back and leaving a vacuum, you wound up with the worst of all worlds. So I think the Iraq case and the Libya case did undercut trust. I think the Iraq case probably much more so.
Melissa Williams.
Thank you so much. Thanks for a fabulous panel. It's a great pleasure to listen to all of you. I had a question about the agents of soft power, the collective agents of soft power, and whether we are witnessing some kind of a transformation. The discussion did focus on non-state collective agents, but I was hoping to bring it back to Brian Hehir's remark about the importance of religion. One of the things I confess that's worrying me in the current context, the current political moment, is the invocation of Judeo-Christian civilization as really the agent here. We can find this in Stephen Bannon's political rhetoric. And some are saying that this is one of the reasons why Republicans are being more open to Putin as an ally, because they see Putin informed by his own ideologue, who is a proponent of Judeo-Christian civilization's conquest over its opponents. So I was wondering if you had any reflections on that.
Well, I think the soft power, which is the ability to produce attraction, can have many different types of agents, from government officials. Barack Obama was an instrument of soft power. The very election of an African-American president, before he did a thing, brought a big jump in the polls of attractiveness of the United States. That's if you want being an agent without much agency, because that happened immediately just by the fact of his election. And similarly, within Russia and Eastern Europe, Putin can be seen as an important agent. But there are many, many different agents. And I think in the long run, a country's soft power comes less from its government than from its civil society. And that takes me back to this example of what I call meta-soft power in Vietnam. Remember, Lyndon Johnson was wildly unpopular. People marching, LBJ, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And yet they were following Martin Luther King and a vision that he had provided, which was very deeply rooted in the American civil rights and African-American tradition. So agents can range from the very top of government to religious figures who may be or may not be centrally placed or not, or they can be missionaries, or they can be if you argue that ISIS or ISIL has soft power, which it obviously does since it attracts a lot of people, some of these killers are actually agents with soft power. Why does ISIS put these beheading tapes on YouTube? Because there is a small number of people who are attracted by that, and they want to attract them to have them fight in their cause. So I think the agency is almost infinite, if you want, and many of these agents are religious, and they could be the Russian Orthodox patriarch working with Putin, or they could be a missionary.
Bob Cohen.
Thank you very much. I want to probe the issue of China's soft power. It's the one issue on which we had a disagreement on the panel. I don't want to let it go. Yuen made a powerful case for an attractive Chinese narrative, as you said. David is skeptical, and Joe, you seem to agree on the basis of China's territorial disputes with its neighbors. But one thing this indicates is that soft power is not simply an attribute of China or the United States. It depends on the audience. We haven't discussed the audience. China's soft power narrative resonates in many places which are not close to China and in which there are no territorial disputes. And I'm very skeptical of this, of any consultancy's ranking. I think it's nonsense to say China is 28th in soft power. I think it's much better than that. It has much more attractiveness in Africa and in Turkey and in part of Latin America than one might have thought otherwise. So do you want to put that much weight, Joe, on the territorial disputes and considering the whole Chinese soft power globally?
I think your point, Bob, is correct that, and I should have taken more time to explain this. It comes out a little bit in my example of the thief and the gun. Soft power depends on the target of the power much more than hard power does. If I bomb you, it doesn't matter too much what you think. But if I'm trying to persuade you, it matters very much what you think. And so the net effect of that is that audience and attention is crucial in judging soft power. And so if you want to take American soft power, just to illustrate that, American soft power in Iran, let's take American films. American films are repulsive to the ruling mullahs, but attractive to young teenagers who want videos to show in their privacy of their apartments. So there's one country, one time, but very different audiences. I think for China, the problem that they have in terms of maximizing their soft power is that it's a very mixed audience. And with the territorial disputes, if nationalism is growing in Asia, which I think it is, in China as well as in the neighboring countries, then China has to ask how can it take certain positions, let's say on rejecting the tribunal on the law of the sea, and how many countries is that going to affect or not affect? What I said to Chinese foreign minister when I talked about this, I said, you ought to go back to your earlier code of conduct for the region, which is a more benign way of doing this rather than dumping sand on islands and creating military bases. Because in the long run, if you're going to be the dominant power in the region, showing that you're benign and willing to create a code of conduct is going to serve you better than your current strategy. But as Yuen pointed out when he scaled these countries on a list of how much they hedge or not, there's some of the Cambodian Laoses which are basically not going to get more than an inch away from China. But Vietnam, where the joke is, the shape of our country is like an S because of the weight of China on our spine for 3,000 years. They're not about there is a deep internal divide in Vietnam about how to relate to China. So in terms of Southeast Asia or South Asia, because they have a problem with India as well, China does, I think a lot depends on which audience and which actions. But there's another audience that China also cares about, which is Europe, America, Latin America, Australia, and that's where China's hurt by its human rights behavior. Because when you lock up Liu Xiaobo and prevent him from going to the Nobel ceremony, and there's an empty chair at the Nobel ceremony because he's in jail and everybody knows it, you have undercut your soft power in Europe. That probably doesn't matter at all in Cambodia. They couldn't, Liu Xiaobo, they're going to lock up their Liu Xiaobo. But when it comes to Europe, America, and other areas, it does make a difference. So I think China has a multiple audience problem, And I think it's partly related to the territorial disputes, but partly related to that they're unable to allow freedom for their civil society because they want tight ported control. And in the process of doing that, they undercut their soft power in other areas as well. But I know Yuen should, or David should comment on, and yeah.
I may just chip in. I agree very much with Joe that the maritime disputes does put it's a problem for China in terms of exercising its soft power in Southeast Asia, and it is so. And in terms of the political values, the Chinese model is not very attractive at all. But we have to balance that. The reason why I placed quite a bit of emphasis on One Belt, One Road is that it is the new exciting thing in Asia. And somehow that narrative is gaining quite a bit of traction and support. Any of those 64 countries that is part of OBO are very interested in being part. We are talking about construction of deep ports. We are talking about railways. We are talking about energy pipelines, connecting Asia, connecting China to Eurasia, to Europe on the land, and through the seas, the maritime, through from Fuzhou to Malaysia, to Djibouti, to Venice. The number of conferences that I witnessed when I first arrived in Singapore on OBO was from every other month would be a conference on OBO. The businessmen, the academics all want to be at it. Oxford's Faculty of Law is also in on the act. They want to talk about the constitutional implications of OBO. So if you Google Oxford Faculty of Law, you Google OBO, you'll find Oxford Faculty of Law, right? So this sounds like and it's by attraction. You don't have to participate, and in fact, I think it's going to face a lot of problems. It's completely unclear whether it will get off the ground because the way China deals with its Muslim minorities and so on, it's going to be problematic on the Western end. But this is a new and attractive idea, and there seem to be quite a lot of takers. And
Catherine Sicking.
Sorry, could I just say a word on that too?
Okay, sure.
Okay. Bob's right that we did have a slight disagreement there, and Yuen has the advantage of being in the region, and I have the advantage of not being in the region. Let's say a few words about China and Africa. I've got students working on this, and it's quite interesting. China's had some foreign policy success in Africa, but that's mostly hard power. It's carrots, not sticks, but it's carrots. And when the Chinese have been operating in Africa, actually they've been fairly systematically alienating the locals through their management style and their interaction style. So I think it has not really helped China in a soft power way. Where China does have soft power in Africa and perhaps some other places is through the admiration emulation pathway, and that's among the regimes who like China's tune about respecting sovereignty, not interfering with the affairs of others, let every country organize its own rights situation the way it sees fit. That is attractive to unattractive regimes. On the South China Sea, I'm beginning to see signs, and I'm hopeful about this, that China is actually beginning to accommodate to the Permanent Court of Arbitration decision. And they won't come out and say so directly, at least not in the next 10 or 20 years. But I honestly do think that the owls inside China, the doves and the owls, are beginning to make headway against the hawks, and that we'll see a soft landing. I hope that's the case.
Catherine.
Well, we're all on this same topic, so at the risk of pushing more, I actually want to ask a conceptual question that connects this debate on soft power in China. And that is, Joe, it almost seems like you are saying that soft power needs to be both government and society, or government and civil society. This is your, your argument about Martin Luther King or Hamilton. And so that raises a question, it's really a question for you and for Yuen, and that is, can China have the same level of soft power as long as it keeps such strict controls on its civil society? Or can Chinese civil society, really just its economic parts of its civil society be sufficient soft power for it to advance?
Well, it's a great question, Catherine, and again, it'll go back to which audience. I mean, for example, there are some in Southeast Asia who will be impressed by this wave of the future narrative, this tough control and so forth. There are others who are not. There will also be major efforts now by China to get further into the entertainment industry. Wang Jianlian, who's the so-called richest man in China, is buying up Hollywood studios, and he is bringing American movie stars to China, trying to get more joint production of films. And the idea is this is how China will increase its soft power. So you'll go to a movie and you'll feel good about China because it was a Chinese film. The question of how well will that work? There's some Chinese film directors who say, if we're not given freedom, we're never going to be as creative, and our films will never be quite in the same rank. I don't know. This is going to be this is something we will test over the next 10 years. I have a hunch that China knows what it's doing at the government level in terms of various programs to increase soft power. I think at the civil society level, you have some businessmen like Wang Jianlian who are making major efforts, but it's not clear to me that they're going to work. And I think against this, you have this increased concern about party control, so that the trends over the last 5 years have been to reduce intellectual freedom, not to increase it, and artistic freedom. So I think the question is open, and it'll depend partly on what audience that you refer to.
Nan, go ahead.
I liked your reference to Hamilton, but it leads me to ask, since examples of soft power in cultural areas, our movies, our TV, also our athletes, our social media, our cultural soft power, many of these are sources of adulation and envy and even emulation, but increasingly they also have a reverse side. It's not just the mullahs, but as some of our artistic expression becomes more radical, more open sexual freedom, whatever, it's not like the 1950s or even the 1970s. You get traditionalists and conservatives reacting against us around the world. And the social media, now that it's also the source of fake news and bullying, it also is a two-edged sword. So since our cultural icons are having these multifaceted dimensions, do you think our soft power in that area is waning, or are you confident that it's robust?
I think there's some areas where it's definitely waning. I mean, if you ask about American culture and the permissiveness of American culture, there's some areas where that's definitely negative. And it can be Saudi Arabia, where it has to do with women wearing bikinis, but it can also be Uganda, where the gay rights movement is regarded as anathema to a majority of the Ugandan people, and they're passing laws to criminalize it. So as they see American plays and movies that celebrate gay freedoms, they regard that as repulsive, not attractive. So this goes, I think Bryan mentioned this point about fragmentation in his initial comments, that we may be seeing a lot more fragmentation. It may be made a lot more difficult to understand because of social media, where audiences are being fragmented.
And I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but
I'm Iram Sattar. I'm finishing up my doctorate at the law school. What I'm really concerned about, I work on water and development. And I'm really concerned when I look at, again, the history of what this country has done, especially in the context of Cold War development politics. The fact is that the government has been deeply involved in developing irrigation economies, the Tennessee Valley Authority, David Lilienthal, the Army Corps of Engineers has been bringing policymakers here forever. And I'm deeply concerned about what's happening in this country and this sort of delinking and pulling back from these deep engagements with the world. If you could talk about, is there any kind of robustness in what our educational institutions and foundations, so this is harking back to, say, the role of the Ford Foundation with the Green Revolution, etc. But do you think that if the government itself pulls back, do you think foundations and academia are robust enough to keep, in the interim, engaging with the world's development problems, including with climate change and ecological disaster, to sort of fill that gap and provide a continuing relationship?
I think my answer is yes. I think that we don't want to overinterpret the 2016 election. After all, it was decided by 100,000 votes in 3 Rust Belt states. But the popular vote was the other way. And if you look at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, it's a poll that came out in September, showed a majority of Americans wanted to stay involved. I would argue that probably the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, American universities may have more impact on soft power than the Voice of America or the policies that the government uses to try to promote public diplomacy. Not that I'm against them, but I just saw a figure, I think, this week. Number of foreign students in the United States this year, 1 million, which is up 7% from last year. It's been continually climbing. And you can say, oh, well, so what? They go home and they don't like us. No, some don't like us. Most actually go back with a much deeper appreciation of what American culture is. And so in that sense, I think I don't see American civil society pulling back, even if the government does pull back. And it's still not clear what the government's going to do. I mean, it's much too early to. We had a panel in this room last week that Susan put together on predicting Trump in Asia, and the answer is we don't know.
We have, our time's just about up. We have 2 more questions and then we're going to have to stop. But our time really is just about up. I'm sorry. Right here, I don't know your name.
Fen Hampson. I guess my question to you is soft power, particularly in the meta sense, a testable proposition for social scientists? You talked about education. When I last checked, there isn't a stampede of people trying to buy real estate in Beijing. It's Vancouver. It's San Francisco, it's points west or eastward, I guess, depending on your point of view. And so my question to you is this going to be a theological debate, or is it a testable proposition? And what would be your metrics or proxy measures?
Well,
you've done some of that in your work.
Well, you can use public opinion polls as a proxy for soft power, asking, is this attractive or not? And you can, if you look at the Pew polls that have been done on this, they ask a set of different questions. Do you approve of American policy, or do you approve of American culture, or do you approve of American science and technology? No, you can get different dimensions of this. So you can get variation over time on these different dimensions. But I was intrigued. I was reading this new book by Gideon Rockman, who is from the Financial Times. It's called Easternization, and it's going to come out this spring. And he takes issue with me and my views that American century is not over. He's a friend. I mean, we've gone back and forth on this a number of times. And he says that China is going to grow more rapidly than I think, and it's going to create this narrative of the future and so forth. So he sees the trend as Easternization, as he calls it. But then he has a chapter which he says, but there's an interesting thing related to soft power. He said, if you ask, can the renminbi become the world reserve currency to replace the dollar, which is a major Chinese objective, it's going to take quite some time and be difficult, because becoming a reserve currency depends not on being in the basket of currencies that the IMF puts into the special drawing rights. Depends upon deep and rich capital markets and a belief that there is a rule of law, so that when you want to withdraw your money that you're holding in renminbi, it's not going to be blocked by some communist official or some corrupt official. And he said the odd thing is that the Americans, because they have a reputation as a stable democracy with a strong rule of law, is able to attract funds. You mentioned the money coming in, Canada would fit the same category. And he said, this is an illustration of American soft power. So I thought it was interesting, since Gideon usually takes the opposite view from me. But that's an anecdote, but it's one example building on what you said about investments.
And the final question will go to the Weatherhead Center Director, Michelle Lamont.
To bring the conversation in a slightly different direction, I have a sociology of knowledge question. I'm very curious about how you understand the conditions of the power of the concept of soft power. How did it come to be cited so widely? If we think about what was happening in your field at the moment where the idea came out, there were real parallels at the same time in terms of the explosion of rational choice. The discipline was going away from culturalism after rejecting the kind of national character argument. At the same time, in my field, which is one of my field is cultural sociology, we have concepts such as narratives, identity. These concepts really move to the very center of sociology. And I find it very interesting that there hasn't been, as far as I know, and maybe you will correct me, more conversation between our field, because one of the classical papers in my field is titled How Culture Works, and it's a paper by Michael Schutson, which talks about retrievability, resonance. We could, or you think even of the Weberian concept of charismatic authority, one could easily think about ways in which our fields could have cross-pollinated. And I'm just very puzzled that it didn't happen, that they really progressed in parallel. So I just would like to conclude by asking you to share your thoughts about the relationship between those fields and why your theory became so important.
Well, it's a great question, and it reinforces in my mind the role of serendipity in intellectual and academic life. In principle, I should have sat down and thought through all the implications, should have read widely in sociology, should have done cultural anthropology, and thought of all these connections. In practice, I was sitting at the kitchen table having totaled up these military balances and these economic balances and saying, something is missing. And then I thought, well, it's that ability to attract. And then I tried to start thinking that through, and as I tended, and this is a professional deficiency, I tended to read back into the literature of political science. And so I looked at, the things that eventually became known in Faces of Power literature and so forth. If I'd been an optimizer rather than a satisficer, I would have done what you said. But I was just trying to satisfy to solve a little thing. And when I published the book, I thought, all right, this scratched an itch, which is I wanted to know why the people who were thinking the Americans were in decline were missing something. And I never expected it to take off the way it did. In other words, I expected to get maybe 15 citations in some political science book or something. But so it was a surprise to me. But I hope that I hope there will be more cross-fertilization with cultural anthropology in particular.
Well,
So,
Joe, thank you so much for thank you to the panel as well. And your lecture's at 4 o'clock, right? And just let me remind you that the Manshel lecture is in here at 4 o'clock, 4:15. But if you want a seat, be here at 4. So we look forward to this and many other themes in the Manshel lecture this afternoon. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for great sharing.